Our next session, we're going to be hearing from Hardy and Michelle. So hello to you both. I can see you on screen. So I'll just welcome everybody back from your coffee break. And it's myself and Sinead Hanrahan were saying on Twitter that nice and all as this is and great as it is to meet everyone, it's just not the same as having those biscuits and looking for scones and chatting in person over a coffee break. But we'll do what we can. So just to move ahead with the second section of our event today, I want to introduce our third speaker, who many of you are going to be familiar with, who's Michelle Dalton. Michelle is Head of Research Services at University College Dublin Library and has responsibility for managing a diverse range of research support functions, which include publishing and bibliometrics, research data management, GIS and mapping, and UCD's Digital Library and Research Repository. So a lot going on there. Michelle has over 10 years professional experience working in academic, medical and special libraries, and has previously worked as a scholarly communications librarian in UCD. And prior to that, as a college liaison librarian with responsibility for teaching and learning and information literacy. Michelle's interests include open science, skills development and designing scholarly communication supports for postgraduate education. Michelle is going to talk to us, as you'll see coming up on screen. Her title is Practical Strategies for Embedding Scholarly Communication in Information Literacy Instruction. So thank you very much, Michelle, and welcome to you. And I can see your screen ready to go, so I'll hand over to you now. Thanks, Michelle.
Great, thanks a lot, Anya. I just want to say I'm really delighted to be here today and speaking about two of my absolute favourite topics, scholarly communication and information literacy. And today I'm going to focus on practical ways really to embed scholarly communication in what I guess some may view as more traditional information literacy instruction. But for anyone who wants to read a little bit more about the theoretical approach and reasoning, I'd really recommend the report from the ACRL that Jane mentioned in her introduction. And two foundations of the argument in this report that really stood out for me are that every librarian in an academic environment is a teacher, and also the idea that all roles in an academic library are impacted and altered by the changing nature of scholarly communication. And if we think about, our services like collections, teaching and learning, research support, even our IT infrastructure, how information and research is created and disseminated, I think is really fundamental to most, if not all, of our services. Also, my own thinking is that, I'm not sure we can expect our students to be able to find, evaluate and use research in a meaningful way if they don't understand the publishing processes and culture behind it, how that research is created and the scholarly structures and system that it comes from or emanates from. And I'd also like to think that introducing open values and research practices at an early stage, including even at student level, can hopefully help foster and develop these habits in our future researchers and generate the change in the research environment and culture that is so important today in helping us to achieve open science. So in practical terms, I think if you're looking for a good structure or place to start for identifying what skills are important, I'd really recommend looking at the Liber Open Science Skills visualization that was published earlier this year. And what I really like about it is that it aligns directly with the Liber roadmap to open science and focuses on, 5 key areas or pillars for capacity building in this area. So fair data, metrics and rewards, scholarly publishing, research integrity, and citizen science. And I think across these broad areas, there are real opportunities to weave and embed some of these topics into a lot of our existing information literacy instruction initiatives, that might focus on more traditional things like sourcing information, finding information, using and evaluating research. And the visualization then breaks down these 5 areas across 4 different types of skills. So digital content creation, information and data literacy, communication and collaboration, and understanding safety and privacy issues. And we can see there, it's very explicit, the mention of information literacy. And I think a lot of these skills already form the basis of what we're doing in terms of IL instruction, including things like, helping students create content in the online environment. helping students understand information and data and bias around that, encouraging peer-to-peer learning, communicating information ethically, and so on. So I think it's really just about kind of integrating or applying the scholarly communication context into what we're doing already in a lot of cases. So I'm going to run through a few practical examples now of scholarly communication topics that I think are particularly timely or relevant right now and might serve as useful starting points or entry points into incorporating some of this area into maybe IL instruction for those who aren't from a scholarly communications or research background. And I've also linked them in with the LIBER Open Science Framework topics as well, so that they're aligned with everything. And I think one of the really exciting things about research activity is that the landscape is changing all the time. So there's lots of opportunities to bring in very real world practical examples. And right now, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's raised a lot of questions around how research is carried out, how research is published and communicated, and the systems around it. And I think this has really brought into focus areas like, the need to find new ways of sharing scholarship, new publishing models, and ways to accelerate dissemination and reduce friction in how people can gain access to research. It's also asked questions about our current rewards and incentive system and, what is it that we really value? Is it highly cited publications, or is it about rigorous, transparent research and, research impact and openness and things like that? We've also seen how the public is engaging with science and research in new ways. I think that's really become apparent of late. And I think there's more of an emphasis now than ever on how researchers need to communicate and share their work effectively with the general public to ensure this is like a two-way dialogue and engage with people. And we're still seeing, which we've seen for many years now, but growing all the time, a very strong emphasis on research data, how it's collected, managed, made available and reused, and how that's now more than ever fundamental to transparent and reproducible research. So these areas have come to the surface of late, and I think, provide some opportunities to give real world examples, in a very accessible way to a lot of students who maybe aren't even engaged in research themselves yet, but there's real world examples that they can relate to, I think, more than ever. So the first topic I'm going to talk about is preprints, and we've seen a really rapid growth in researchers sharing early stage work now since the start of COVID-19. But even before this, I think preprints were on an upward trajectory and had been expanding into different discipline areas outside more traditional areas like physics or working papers in economics or so forth. And now that researchers are sharing a lot more work that isn't peer-reviewed, the importance of critical evaluation skills, a traditional information literacy skill, and understanding the difference between how we might interpret early stage research and formally published peer-reviewed research, I think is more important than ever, Also, with the number of retractions increasing that we're seeing even for peer-reviewed work, it shows how peer review isn't a perfect system in itself, and that evaluation, critical evaluation, and correcting the scientific record is really an ongoing process that doesn't really ever end in many ways. And I think as preprints become, more popular and more prevalent as a form of communication, it's likely that students will also start using them as sources and citing them as sources, maybe in their essays and assignments more often. And this provides a good opportunity, I think, to discuss aspects like quality, evaluating information, what the peer review process looks like, the value that the peer review process adds, and you can do various activities maybe with students around, comparing a preprint with the final published article or a version of record, and getting students to have a look at the differences between both to help them understand, how research evolves. As I said, the value that the peer review process can bring to research and limitations around the peer review process as well, but so that they get a sense of, how the scholarly conversation develops over time. Predatory or fraudulent publishing, I think, is another area which is actually very topical. and a useful way to address the area of the scholarly publishing. And I think it helps develop skills and competencies in students around the area of evaluation, again, in particular. But for postgrads and maybe early stage researchers, I think it provides a real opportunity to discuss the steps and elements in the publishing process, which is new to a lot of postgraduate students, I think, and very few people ever talk them through, what's involved in publishing from start to finish and the process that brings. So being able to identify quality venues, I think, is also important for sourcing information for students as well as those who might want to publish. So this topic could even be introduced, let's say, as part of discussion around information discovery, identifying quality sources or reputable sources to use in your research. And I think a useful activity, and one that I've used before in workshops, is to print out a selection of, calls for papers or submission invitations from, fraudulent or predatory journals, as well as, reputable publishers, and get students to maybe work in pairs and identify some of the red flags in these that might need to be fact checked. And also, examples of good, transparent practice by reputable publishers as well. So that they get a sense of, the services that publishers should be providing and the steps and processes involved in good publishing. So moving on to the metrics and rewards theme of the Libre framework, research evaluation, I think, is probably one of the biggest challenges in the research environment today, as Katie spoke extensively about earlier this morning. And whilst many may see this area as being more relevant to active researchers who are, actively publishing, I think the misconception that citations represent research quality is a very far-reaching idea, and students in particular can often think that highly cited works are automatically, the best quality research or the most excellent research. So even at quite an introductory level, I think it's a really good opportunity to discuss things like how some retracted articles, for example, can be very highly cited, and then how other outputs like books or software or practitioner-focused research outputs can actually have real impact and be very high quality research outputs in their own way, even if they're not highly cited. I think research integrity then is an area that's actually a real opportunity for libraries to become more involved in, as well as funders have ramped up their requirements in this area and their expectations around, good research practice. So I think information literacy instruction has always been really strong in this area, actually, in terms of plagiarism and using information ethically and so on. And our existing strengths in this area are an obvious gateway to expanding the conversation into broader areas in the research integrity space. So things like falsification and fabrication of data in particular, and questionable research practices. So I think it's really a natural extension of what a lot of us are already doing in terms of information literacy instruction, but maybe we haven't actually explicitly referred to it as research integrity before. Instead, we've been, using terms like academic integrity and plagiarism and ethical use of information, but by maybe branding it under the research integrity kind of theme or idea, it will be more meaningful to some of our different users in the research space. And finally, the last area I'm going to mention is research data management, and this is part of the Libre FAIR data theme. And I think research data management is actually quite a complex and complicated area, even for experienced researchers to learn about. So, a lot of people might think, bringing it up with students is too much for them to deal with at that kind of early stage. But I think actually you can make it quite accessible by just focusing on very basic concepts like, what is research data? What do we mean by research data? Get students to think about the data they use in their assignments and their essays and, what it looks like in different disciplines. So if you're a historian, what is your research data versus if you're a scientist, what is your research data and how data looks different in different disciplines. And I think also another useful entry point is, helping students find and reuse existing data sets that are out there, you could bring up some of the FAIR principles in terms of, the importance of being able to reuse other people's data, being able to find it easily, being able to understand it by documenting it correctly and in a meaningful way. And you can bring up these themes without actually having to relate it back to the students' own research data as such, but rather their reuse of others. And I think it's really important to get students thinking about research data at the earliest stage possible, because often one of the challenges with RDM is that people kind of don't think about it at all. So that's a quick overview of some of the topical areas that I think are useful ways of embedding scholarly communication into information literacy instruction. But as a key takeaway, I guess, I think that a lot of the traditional information literacy competencies and approaches that we're already kind of well familiar with at this stage are actually really fundamental in helping to develop open science skills in our future researchers. So perhaps I think we maybe just need to make those links a little bit more explicit and meaningful, I guess, in a research context as well.
Michelle, thank you so much. I got so interested at the beginning, I forgot that I was also meant to be timekeeping. So thank you for being perfect with your timekeeping, seeing as I forgot. I'm just checking, I don't see anything Q&A at the moment. Maybe if my colleagues who are monitoring chat can let me know. I actually am going to take advantage of chairing it to ask a question. I just thought your initial propositions were just excellent in terms of that idea that we're all involved in teaching, first of all, and also that idea of incorporating scholarly information. I think that marriage of teaching and scholarly information isn't happening as successfully as it could. And I think, interestingly enough, the idea of research data management, I agree, can be quite clearly explained to students, even at an initial stage, by building on what we always talk about in terms of that their research builds on others' research and how that gets used and so on. One of the things I've brought up in other contexts, a question that I have is, I agree with you, understand the point about citations not necessarily being equivalent to quality and so on, but we do know, as those of us who are in teaching roles, that it's a nice shortcut if we're explaining to certainly undergraduate students. Have you any suggestions about other ways we can have those conversations with students in ways, different to what we do at the moment, where we do say things like, well, if it's being cited this amount, and in fact, our library systems promote that because those higher cited items is what they'll see first and so on.
Yeah, and I think it certainly is true in some cases that highly cited papers are also excellent papers. So it's not a bad indicator. But I guess it's just about broadening the conversation around that. So saying to students, yes, a highly cited paper may be, very influential in the field, but it doesn't necessarily mean that, it's a high quality paper. It could be influential or have, gain attention because it's maybe, been retracted, like I said, or for negative reasons. So it's just about kind of broadening out the conversation you're already having, and I guess saying, look, it can be a useful shortcut, but you need to view it in a more holistic way, I think.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks. And I'm glancing through chat, Michelle, and lots of positive comments for you. And I'd agree with this comment that's coming in, just saying how much that they've enjoyed your talk and that they'd like to hear you say more and continue to talk on. And I'm the same. There's so many ones. I'm just glancing down in case it didn't make it to Q&A, in case there's any other questions. If anybody would like to unmute and ask a question or offer a viewpoint, we've got a couple more minutes. So if anybody wants to just speak up, that's perfect as well. And I'm just checking down through the chat.
I just put a question in the chat. It's Jane.
Oh, just seen it there. Thanks, yeah. Jane. That's great. Oh yeah, I see there's one come from Peter. Thank you, Peter. Michelle, great talk as always. And Peter's wondering if you've thought about how to engage with academics around these topics. Excellent question, Peter. Thanks.
Yeah, I always think they're the people you really need to kind of work with on it. And I think I would say mainstreaming out kind of a lot of these topics to other roles in the library outside traditional research support is key in this area. So, a lot of our colleagues in UCD, the liaison librarian team, would have very strong relationships with academics already. And that's an obvious way to kind of make those connections. So mainstreaming out, and I think Jane touched on this early actually about like removing the silos. So getting everybody in the library, or certainly most people who are involved in teaching or relationship type roles, involved in these kind of scholarly communication topics, I think is the obvious way, so that the message comes from a variety of different channels, and academics are hearing it all the time and seeing the relevance of it in various ways, and not just from, let's say, a research support unit or whatever.
Thanks a million. That's great. And I think, I think you're exactly right. I mean, that's why I think we've had so much interest in this event and why this event is so important. My own role is a teaching role. And I know that sometimes I find when I'm in the conversations where it's about more research driven topics, I feel a bit uncertain of my territory and understanding fully. And you're right, it needs to be less siloed and more and spread out more. I think you've really hit the nail on the head there, as indeed Jane had earlier. Just double checking, no further questions. Michelle, thank you so much. That was